Hey Dave, welcome back to the Changemakers podcast. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Dave. Nice to be back.
Excellent, excellent. This is the first two-parter that we've done, so it's amazing. We actually had our first returning guest recorded yesterday in terms of recorded an episode, and then it's back a couple of years later. And now this is the first part two, so it's exciting times for the Changemakers. Thanks for being a part of it once again.
Yeah, great. Pleasure.
I loved our conversation last time. It was so insightful to hear about your very squiggly, very unconventional, but hugely interesting career journey. And that's really why I was so keen to do a part two, because I think that's only part of your career journey. I think a big part of what's happening in your career right now and in recent years is going to be equally interesting to our listeners, especially those who maybe, and this is a lot of people around the world, not just related to design and creative, but haven't quite got it all figured out yet, or maybe are in the throes of one of those slightly squiggly career journeys, which is essentially kind of how that career experience has influenced your views on where you are now, and the design scene and creative scene, especially in the world of tech and startups in general. So it'd be really, really good to dive into that with you. And the place I wanted to start, if it's okay, with how your career experience has influenced your perspective on design leadership, because this is something we cover a lot on the Changemakers. It's something that we speak to our clients a lot about as well. We have a lot of creative leaders as clients, and I know that they're constantly battling this challenge, if you like, of doing great work, but also making sure that they set their teams up to do great work as well. And that's kind of where I want to start, really, if it's okay, was asking you, what an in-house team needs, in your opinion, in order to produce good work.
Yeah, good question. I think on the design leader question, it's a strange one, because the standard route in design, you start off as a kind of solo designer, and you're very focused on your own work and your style and that kind of thing. And I think probably a shift in the way that creative works is, when I was earlier in my career, there was kind of a competitive edge to it. If you were in a studio, you were normally competing with other designers to get your idea across the line. You're presenting to clients, and there might be the magic 3 options, and yours is one of them, and you really want to win. And there's no real training from going from that kind of designer to a design leader. And it's often talked about, creative director, that's a completely different ball game to actually being a designer. And I think the main shift is, you notice that instead of getting pleasure from your own ideas, you start to get that same kick from seeing other designers present ideas. And that's something that for me was quite recent, actually. You go into a session, you look at the work that your team's doing, and you just get really excited by what they're showing you, and that's great. And I much prefer it to doing something myself, So then you start to become interested in, how can I help that person do that more and all the time, So I think it depends on the type of designer you are. I mean, where I work, we have IC and manager tracks. So you can be a designer and get to a director level being an IC, an individual contributor, or you can choose to go into the manager track. And if you go into the manager track, then you're trained and you're helped to kind of develop that side of you. And I think it depends entirely on you as a designer. You can't force a really great IC into a manager role just because they get to that level of seniority, So yeah, as far as the leadership and the direction goes, it's all about that flip from wanting your own idea to be the best to wanting to help everyone else to create great ideas. And that's the change, really, I think. And like I say, it all depends on individual, what your thing is, as a designer. I think one thing that I learned, which is a bit of an eye-opener, really, and again, it was quite a recent thing. One thing for any young designers listening to this who are scared about getting old, it's actually pretty great. and I'm still going through stages and phases and discovering new sort of facets of work that I've never been involved with before, that I'm getting a lot of enjoyment from. And one thing that I suddenly realized, when I started my career, I went to see a lot of designers and I went to a lot of studio presentations and live talks and that kind of thing. And there's normally someone on the stage that'll present some amazing story about the studio and all the jobs that they've done, that kind of thing. And it's like, wow, and it's all around kind of style and stuff. What no one ever told me was that I figured out recently, if you're a designer, you're in the people business. It's a people job. It's not an art job. It's not a making, expressing yourself as an artist. It's you give things to people. You're making things for people. And there was a great piece from the Rick Rubin book, The Art of Creativity, I think it's called.
Yeah, that was my
serves me
Secret
right.
Santa present actually for something
Oh,
in the studio.
fantastic! Yeah, I mean, great book. There was a piece in that where he says, if you're an artist, you're not making art for other people. You're making it for yourself. You're expressing yourself. And when I read that, I suddenly thought, yeah, that's the difference between art and design. If you're a designer, you're making things for people to use. So it really is a people business. People will give you jobs. They will give you really good briefs or bad briefs. They will come to you with problems. And once you've solved them, people use what you've done, whether it's product design, whether you're designing user interfaces, whatever it is. So it's a people business. So people skills. You've got to like people. You've got to understand people, and you've got to be curious about what makes them tick. And that translates directly into being a leader.
Yeah.
You have to have an interest in the designers on your team and helping them to grow.
And actually, speaking of that, so you mentioned about the IC and the manager tracks. Is part of being a good leader, in your opinion, to spot, well, to hire kind of people who either want to go down both of those routes or could potentially, if they don't necessarily know that, and also nurturing them down those routes as well, because they're both equally important. Obviously, you need people who want to manage, because obviously that is a key part of multifaceted teams, but also designers, as you know, can often be a little bit introverted, maybe a bit reluctant to go down that route, and that's fine as well, as you say. But do you find that a key part of it is nurturing those kind of mindsets from the off, and also in terms of the hiring side of things, making sure you hire along both tracks?
Yeah, I think so. I think hiring is really important, and I hired last year, and it took about 3.5 months to get the right person, and we did get the right person. But there's no shortcut to it. You can't get someone in immediately. You've got to really take the time. And I think Stephen Bartlett was talking about startup CEOs, and he said, when you get to a certain stage, once you're up and running, if you're not dedicating a third of your time as a CEO to hiring, then you're doing something wrong.
Wow.
And he said himself that his role was hiring, basically. Once the vision was in motion and he had some traction. And I think hiring is super important. You can't fix a bad hire once you've brought them in. Hire fast and repent at leisure, definitely. But it's a tricky process, and you can put it in a box and say hire for a cultural fit, for example. But we put a lot of emphasis on that. It's not so much a cultural fit. You're hiring someone who has a particular outlook, and I mentioned it in the last session that we did. You're looking for someone who's a puzzle piece with bits that will fit with the other designers that you've got. And another thing about hiring is you tend to, I didn't know this until I started to hire people, but when you're applying for jobs and that kind of thing, you're in this whole frame mind, like pick me, and you think that you're going to go along as an individual and help that business. What the person that's hiring doesn't tell you is the effects that you will have on the rest of the team. They're not just looking for someone to fix immediate problems in a business. They're looking for someone to really put a rocket up the rest of the team and to help them, and inspire them. So that's important as well. But yeah, in terms of, we're essentially always looking for solutions to a problem that we've got. That's another thing with hiring. I think a tip for if you're applying for a job, when you see a job ad, it won't tell you what the problem is. it will say something along the lines of, we're in an exciting time in our growth. You can translate that into whatever you want, but you are essentially that you're a solution to a problem that the business has, and they haven't told you what it is. So you've got to try and figure that out. So if you want to do really well in interviews, look at the business, dig into it, look at everything, look at their website, everything, and try and figure out what that problem is. So when you
That
go
was my
to the
question,
interview,
actually. Are there any ways of finding that out more proactively, I suppose? Maybe trying to talk to people within the business.
yeah,
I hear this a lot in sales roles, especially, sales hiring, when kind of preferred candidates are the ones that often go above and beyond and effectively pitch existing salespeople what's it like to work there. What are the key challenges? What are the people like? What makes a good fit here? I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit extreme for some people, but there are definitely kind of passive and then more proactive ways of finding that information out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not a shortcut to getting a job, because it's still going to be about your experience and, like I say, how well you can solve the immediate problem with the business that they're hiring the position for in the first place. But there are definitely things like that, and I'm surprised that people don't do it more often. I have had a couple of people who've actually just connected for a chat to find out if they want to apply. That's interesting, because it puts the pressure on me. It's like they're evaluating whether or not they want to work with me. But I am surprised that people don't do it more often. And it's like the old thing of the cover letter. There's a lot of nonsense about advice to people applying for jobs. Don't write a cover letter and this kind of thing. Cover letter isn't a kind of boring legacy from times gone by. It's just a space where you actually can write down, prove that you understand the business, and that you're actually applying for something particular, and that you're the right person for the job. So I'm not saying everyone write a cover letter, but to your point, yes, definitely it's 100% a good idea to reach out to people and have chats, because aside from talking about what doesn't go in a job ad, what they don't tell you, aside from the salary and all the rest of it, the most important thing, I'd probably say more than salary, if I'm honest, is who you're going to be working with, and what's the day-to-day of working with them going to be like. Do you like them? Do they enrich you and your career? Do you learn from them? So yeah, definitely recommended that, to reach out.
Yeah, it makes such a difference. The people that you work with, I think we've all felt it in roles that we've been in, where you feel like you're a valued part of the team and you enjoy the people that you work with, and when you quite clearly don't. And it's a horrible experience for everyone involved. If you don't feel you're the right fit, that projects onto the rest of the team, but also obviously mentally within yourself. It's not a nice place to be. Just a final point on design leadership. I just wondered if there was anything else aside from hiring the right team, getting them into a rhythm of working, but what else makes great work from an in-house team perspective, in your opinion?
Oh, lots of things. I think in our team, so we have as one of our operating principles kindness, and that's probably, anyone listening to this is probably going to think, oh, come on, especially if you're in the UK. I think the Americans are kind of more or less okay with it, yeah, kindness. But I 100% believe in that. I think it's kindness is one of those words. It's like one of those words when you're younger, when you're a kid, and they encourage you not to use words like nice and kind and that kind of thing. But kindness is really a power in business, internally, in a time, and in a team. Kindness will help you through very difficult projects, and we have lots of ways that we express that in the team. Extremely kind of considerate and respectful. We have some crazy fires that we fight, and I'm amazed that no one ever loses their cool. It's all very calm, and yeah, so we
It's
get
also
on.
kind.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that kind of gets into the whole thing of soft skills. People say that with remote working comes a new focus on soft skills and that kind of thing. And I think projecting into the future, that is going to be increasingly more important in business. And you can do the two things. People always say, "Oh, business is ruthless and it's focused, and there's no time for emotion and personal." I don't think that's true at all. I think you can absolutely have the two things.
Agree. It's emotional intelligence, isn't it? At the end of the day, I think that
absolutely,
which kindness is a part of 100%, and I completely agree with you on that one. But having a high kind of EQ, as they call it, is such a powerful tool, especially as you say in today's era of remote working.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else in terms of producing great work? What about from a kind of team structure perspective, in terms of setting your team? Because I hear this a lot, that it's a constant struggle to, especially when resources are finite, as you know they pretty much always are. Setting your team up with the right skill sets within team members, and then how you, if the resources are extra finite and you can't bring people on board, develop those team member skill sets to branch out maybe into other areas, especially because, you know, brand design and that side of things is so multifaceted these days.
Yeah, I think in terms of design leadership, design teams need special care. You know, if you're going to motivate and inspire, and I think that's probably one thing, not just for creative leaders, but for any business leaders, you bring the vision and you bring the inspiration, and you've got to be there every day, keeping that momentum going. You know, you need the momentum. Once you get up and running, you need to just keep spinning that wheel. So I think, yeah, inspiring, and also I think just being available and making sure that you understand really well what the designers need to be inspired. You know, designers need good problems to solve, and they need to know that what they're doing is valuable in a business. Often they can feel a bit undervalued, and I think you need to really dig down into the things that fire them up. You know, I know that I wake up every day and I can't wait to get stuck into solving problems. I love it, you know, and that's common to a lot of designers. It's not generally, I'm going to go back to saying it's not a salary thing. Of course, you have to get paid. There's nothing like, you want to get rid of those barriers from designers' minds when they're working on something. You want them working on something 100% and giving 100%. You don't want them thinking, I'm not getting paid enough for this, you know. So salary absolutely has to be right, but I think designers need to feel that what they're doing is worthwhile. I think designers plug into company vision a lot more than, for example, salespeople. You know, some of my best friends are salespeople. Nothing against salespeople, love salespeople. Without them, the business falls apart. But I think with sales, for example, yes, bonuses, compensation, that kind of thing. It's just a different set of motivations for designers. And if you've been a designer yourself and you've left roles because of things that you're not getting from them, then you understand a little bit more about what they need, I think.
Yeah, and actually, and this comes back to something that we've discussed, actually not in person, but over Google Docs, funnily enough, and which is this your idea of the contract, essentially. So, you know, I think it's this thing about, you know, creatives turning ideas into their ideas, and as you say, sometimes they can almost feel like art in a way, because especially with designers, you know, they are very visual ideas that the individual is quite passionate about. But then, as you say, there has to be a commercial. There has to be a commercial angle to them, otherwise they're not going to work. So, and that really affects everything that they do, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the contract and the transaction is just something that really interests me. And I think you can talk about creative generally, but we're talking here about creative in a business context. You know, that transformation of creative into money, into solving business problems. You know, helping business to grow and sustain itself. And I think how that transaction is done defines everything. So when we talk about the difference between being a freelancer, in-house, or agency, just as an example, you know, an agency the contract there is a business goes to them with a problem, might be positioning, might be, you know, rebrand, whatever. And the agency will put together a package and they will say to them, this is your problem, this is how we solve it. Everything's agreed, you sign the contract, the clock starts running, and the designers get to work. When you get to that point where that's finished and it's wrapped up, you then charge them. So that means that a designer in an agency has a definite remit, and the client can't change their mind halfway through, because
some of them try
all the time. Yeah. And I remember working in agencies and having clients who were fired or someone come in and say, right, everyone stop work. The brief has changed. This is, stop. So the clock's running, and that affects you as a designer because you're protected from constant changes, and or you'd like to think that you would be. But you'll have something worked into the brief, 2 rounds of amends or whatever. So that you've got that to do, and you don't have to do anything more. You don't have to do 5, because the agency's losing money when you do that. So the transaction and the contract actually defines the way that you work, and it defines how you feel as a designer when you're working on that particular piece of work. If you go to in-house, it's a whole different thing, because in-house you have your salary and you're in the world of 25 rounds of amends on multiple projects all at once. So if you're talking about building an in-house brand, you need to understand that your team needs that same kind of protection, and that falls on the creative leadership, because it's otherwise it's the Wild West. And the people that have brought these creative teams in-house often don't have a design background. They don't understand. They might understand how sales works, and they understand how marketing works, but they don't understand how designers and design works. So it's not their fault, but you do need to have that in place. I mean, Carta, for example, we have a creative resources manager, creative ops, really important.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in agencies, you would have account managers and that kind of thing, but there wasn't so much like creative ops. But we have that in Carta. That's one ring. The second ring of protection is the culture and the kindness that I talked about, that we build ourselves. And then the other thing is the leaders. So our CD, Josh, fantastic creative director. He didn't come from a traditional design background. He comes from like Hollywood and shooting movies and that kind of thing. He then went to Carta in sales, learned the product inside out, and then went to product marketing. And he's now the creative director,
Wow.
And he is a superb creative director. I've been in creative agencies, and I don't think you could have a standard creative director in Carta, because it's hardcore B2B. It's really dense product, really complicated. You have to have someone with that sales background. Mm-hmm. But what he's got, which is interesting when you talk about kind of hybrid roles, and what makes a great creative leader, he understands the product and he understands the nuts and bolts on one side, but he also understands how creatives think, because he's got that background in movie making and writing scripts and stories. He's really big on the story side of things. So good teams, they're individual to each business. There's not a formula that you can overlay. You've got to find what works best for the business. Ultimately, you're talking about bringing the business strategy to market. So you need to find a way of doing that in the most effective way possible through creative. But it might not be the standard setup,
Yeah. I mean, there's so much good advice in there. There's so much. I particularly love hearing about creative directors who come from slightly unconventional backgrounds. I mean, Hollywood is not had that one yet, but I think you're exactly right. Great creative leaders don't always have to come from this kind of stock pathway of, being a designer and then going to an agency, rising to kind of creative leadership in an agency, then coming over, which is something that we hear a lot of. I think those more unconventional sides are really interesting. And also, something that crops up time and time again is having that business nous, understanding the product, understanding the language of business, understanding the language that your customers speak. I think any department in the business needs to have that, but it's not always the case in terms of creative teams. Listen, I mean, I'm already conscious of time, because we could literally talk for hours again. I'm so fascinated by this. I would actually have loved to have asked you a few more questions on that side of things, on the team at Carta specifically, but I do want to just move on and talk a little bit about something that you just mentioned there, actually, which is collaboration, collaboration with agencies, but also, actually just touching on what I said, collaboration internally across the business, because I think that it's so important to getting great work done. And I would really love to know how you're career experience, which has obviously, as we said in part one, has involved a lot of work within agencies, both as a freelancer, as a permanent member of the team. I'd love to know kind of how that's influenced your views on this kind of pros and cons of in-house versus agency in terms of who handles what, in all in the aim of getting great work done.
Yeah, I think there are two myths about creative. I think the first one is, and it's very strange, not just creative, but any kind of artist or innovator or visionary, that it's all down to one person. I don't know why that is, but we're constantly kind of seeking out this, like, who's the genius behind this thing? And the truth is that any brilliant creative is the result of lots of people back and forth of ideas until something pops up. And I think you need that catalyst, and you need someone who's going to dig into all that stuff and pull out the idea. But it's certainly not an individual operation. And when you talk about building really good in-house creative teams, you need to create that environment where that's going to happen. And good teams are made of lots of different types of people. Someone who's great at talking, someone who's great at presenting, someone who's great at taking a lot of confusion and getting some clarity, someone else who's great at creating interesting confusion. You need that combination to work properly. And I think that myth of the single visionary and creator is a strange one. It's like Apple. Some people are like, it's Steve Jobs, no, it's Johnny Ive, no, it's Steve Wozniak. It's all of them. You can't, there's no point in trying to figure out who the truth is. It's not very interesting. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's not very interesting to hear about a call here and a call there, and someone noticed something down and someone remembered something and brought that to. It's a lot more interesting to think this guy walked out and he was hit by a lightning bolt and suddenly the Mac appeared. So I think that's the first myth. And I think the second myth about creative is it doesn't really matter about how it's made, it's about the end result. The end result is the thing, the ad line, the incredible image, the movie on the screen, whatever it is. And that's like really problematic. And I think that comes back to AI and creativity. I don't know if we're going to get onto that later, but here's my take on that. What is really important about creative is the process shows up in the result always. You might not know it, but you can feel it. And the problem with AI is someone's had this amazing idea that, first of all, that the problems in the world that we have at the moment are that we don't know how to make pictures or write songs, or that's all the good stuff. That doesn't need fixing. Plenty of other stuff. But what we're finding now, I think, and it's amazing how rapid it's been from this kind of like proliferation of AI images everywhere, how quickly we've got bored of it.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is they're so easy to make. There's no process in there, and it's probably a result of creatives not being able to talk about the process enough. They're always saying, "Oh, don't ask me about the creative process; it just happens," or "It's a squiggly line," or "It's a mess," or "It's this, that, and the other." And to rational people, that doesn't make any sense. So they'd say, "Well, okay, well, if it's so hard to define, then it's not important. So let's just get to the end result. Let's just make an image or make a movie with in a few minutes." But that's why everyone's getting bored of it so quickly, and why it's not going to be a lasting solution to anything. The process. I mean, there's movies just come out about Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, decades and decades and decades, and I was. Over the Christmas period, I was watching all the original Star Wars movies and stuff like that. Incredible. If you watch a science fiction movie that was made at the same time as Star Wars, it looks ridiculous. But you could watch Star Wars and there's something in there that is a bit special that's made it timeless,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in processes of things, so I'm always digging into how straplines were made, or how brands were made, or iconic movies, how they were made, and the process is usually as interesting as the final thing, and it's gone into making that final thing. just as an example of that, I was watching, all these, this kind of thing that you get on LinkedIn at the moment. Sora 0.25 has been released, and we should all be worried. All that crazy kind of language that I don't know where that comes from, and where everyone is like, we should all be worried. Like, no, we shouldn't be worried, because here's a version of Blade Runner that someone's made, and it took 2 minutes, and they made it in the bedroom, and you look at it and like, yeah, and so what? I was watching this video of a cat making a meal, and it was a cat.
Oh, I think I saw that.
Yeah, doing the stir fry, and it's chopping vegetables. And I'm watching this thing thinking, why aren't I more excited by this? This is a cat chopping vegetables with a cleaver. This is amazing. And I was watching it, and I got to the end, and I thought, well, firstly, it's got that AI, tinge, taste, which no one's been able to get rid of that. I don't know if they ever will, but it's a strange thing where people say the objective is to get to the point where you can't tell what's a real image and what isn't. That seems to be the thing which is peculiar. But I was watching this cat, and I thought, why am I not feeling anything? Why is it not giving me any kind of, because it is in itself super interesting. And then I thought about the Tetley chimps. So the Tetley chimps, for anyone who doesn't know, in the 80s, there was a huge campaign that ran for decades, I think, with a bunch of chimpanzees drinking tea. So they got these chimpanzees in clothes and that kind of thing. It was huge. It was so popular. It's one of the biggest commercials of the 80s. And I was thinking, well, you can make the Tetley chimps with AI in a couple of minutes now. But the reason that the Tetley chimps were so interesting and so fun, and it caught people's attention, was people were thinking, how do they get chimps to do that? Because they're real chimps. Problem with AI is you know exactly how the thing was made, because it's a prompt, So it's kind of like chewing gum. And I think all of the AI imagery and that kind of thing is being made in a very short period of time is going to become chewing gum under desks and on your shoes, and everyone's just going to get really, really tired of it. But that's not to say that I'm anti-AI, because I use it every day. I use ChatGPT and that kind of thing, and Notebook LM. I think it's amazing. But the goosebump moments I've had with AI have been probably like Notebook LM and text-based, more than images.
It's interesting. So I think the issue that the problem is essentially that people just call AI. There's lots of different types of AI. There's AI that's useful. There's AI that can embed into your processes. And then there's the type of AI that basically wants to do everything from a single prompt. And they're completely different things, really, because ultimately one is a final output and another one is like an intern or an assistant that's just sat next to you, that you can just kind of ask to do something, they do it. And then, that helps you to save a little bit of time. But I just wanted to come back to your process points. I think it's really, really interesting. I suppose the angle of my question was when you're looking at how to make your processes within your team as efficient and effective as possible, and particularly looking at kind of this in-house versus agency thing. How's your kind of experience of working in agencies and being on the other side of the coin? How's that kind of influence the way that you kind of put those teams and processes together to get them to work in the best possible way, including how you use AI, as part of that process, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think one of the things about AI versus agency that everyone says, particularly prospective designers who are thinking of shifting to in-house, they say, oh, well, it's not exciting because it's the same problem day in, day out that you're dealing with. And, in an agency, it's great fun because you have lots of different things that come along. And I would say the opposite on that. I would say that in an agency, you never get really enough time to solve the problem properly. It's what you're given is a snapshot. And because, again, going back to transactions, you have to solve a problem in a finite amount of time. And what you hand over it's done. And then you move on to the next thing. And I think this comes back to the problem with agencies generally. And one of the things that I think is causing a lot of issues for agencies, you then kind of move on to the next thing, the next job, and it's all about sort of pace and velocity. So businesses need teams in-house because things are moving really fast. and your brand kit that you've been delivered from the agency, you open it up and you start using some of it, and it will work for a period of time, and then you have to outsource to another designer who doesn't quite get the style and doesn't have the same level of talent, so they can't continue it. So I think, working a problem, it takes a long time to solve business problems. It's not a quick fix. So if you're delivering a brand package as an agency to a business, for what you're spending, for the cost, you're expecting that it's going to propel your business for a year, maybe 2 years. And rebrands are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, And I think that the era of rebrands has gone, and it's all about brand evolution now. And it's a bit of a buzzword, brand evolution. But, it's perfectly possible to have various iterations of your brand going at once, and testing and that kind of thing. And that all needs to be done very close to business and very close to strategy. You can't parachute in from outside and pretend that with a few stakeholder calls you're going to kind of get your heads around that. But I think I don't want to be down on agencies because I'm talking to a guy who's a really good B2B specialist agency. But I think the agencies that are smart at the moment are understanding that, and I think agencies are rebranding, and there's a lot of we're rethinking how we work and that kind of thing. And I think agencies, there's a lot of opportunity now. Agencies that are thinking about how they collaborate and their business model are the ones that are going to be really effective. How can you effectively pull up alongside something in motion and jump in and help, and then stay next to them and give them that sort of collaborative help? And I think when I was on the Bring Your In Bold podcast that you guys did, the webinar, sorry, there was a session where you were talking with a client of yours in the States. I can't remember the name of the business, but you could just feel that you had that kind of relationship and that sort of synergy that I think is really important. And that's where the smart money, I think, is with agencies.
Do you find that there's also, from your point of view and from your team's point of view, either hesitancy or just straight up real kind of reticence that agencies might take a long time to really understand the business like you do, especially with a business like Carta, as you've already mentioned earlier on, is quite a complex product and business to understand?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's another thing. If agencies can figure out how to solve that problem, give me a call. Yeah, I'd be really interested to know. But it's a seemingly unfixable problem. You bring an in-house designer in, they'll have onboarding sessions, they'll gradually get to understand the product. And I mean, I can say that Carta is a complex product, but maybe all products are complex. Just because you're selling a pair of shoes doesn't mean it's any less difficult, the problem that you've got to solve. In terms of like identifying who you're selling to, and then that maybe needing to suddenly shift because the way that things are at the moment, everything's moving so fast. So I think we're actually going through that process at the moment. So we're wanting to scale really fast, and we have this amazing core team, but we're looking at different ways that we can collaborate with external people. And the problem is exactly that. Like, how do you take what you've done and amplify it to someone who doesn't have that same deeper understanding of the knowledge? And I think first of all, you need good people in the internal team who can direct and who can communicate properly, and who can take someone who doesn't know your brand at all and quickly get them to a level where they can produce work that's reflective of your brand and isn't going off in another direction. And I think on the agency side, having designers who are people designers, who are able to go into a business and understand how chaotic it is and how they can help. And that I guess comes back to the hiring idea. Maybe it's a different model of designer on both sides. You need connecting pieces in the external agency, and you need connecting pieces in the internal to make that work. Because I think that's where we're going. We're getting towards more collaboration and more synergy, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a conversation that we have a lot here at Shape by. We've grown. I think our headcount's up something like 46% in the last year. I mean, partly because we are very much specialists, as you say, in the B2B world, and our clients. We've managed to expand our roster of clients because of that. But then on the flip side of that, it means that from a hiring point of view, again, coming back to something we talked about before, we have to be really diligent in who we hire, and we have to be confident that they are the kind of people that will quickly get up to speed with what you've just talked about there, really, which is how clients with complex tech products and brands like to work, what they need to know, how quickly will they get up to speed with that, how competently will they be able to produce the work that's needed under those conditions. A lot of our clients are in the States. You'll know this full well, but that kind of remote collaboration as well needs to be really, really smooth, and the synergy needs to be there. We're really, really conscious of that. And it's a constant challenge. But, going back to the theme of this part of the discussion, collaboration, as you said, is 100% the biggest thing. Understanding where clients want to collaborate closely, because there are some areas and even some clients that don't necessarily want to. They just want it to be more of a transactional relationship. But for the most part, clients really, really want to bring us on as an extension of their team, and that means having the right people who are able to do that, not just from a design point of view, but from a client services point of view as well. The people that can understand their challenges and translate those into briefs and conversations with our team. So it's, in a way, two sides of the same coin, your world and our world. We're just looking at it from slightly different areas, but there is a point where it all comes together.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting because I went from being this solo designer and the whole freelance ethos, and I loved being independent and just me. And I thought, I can do everything here. I can do the idea, and I can do the concept, and I can write the copy and the whole thing. And I used to enjoy that. And then I went to agencies and then in-house, and I became a real in-house advocate, and I still am. I think that's the future. But then I've come to realize, actually, we can't do everything in-house. It's quite an important realization. I thought, no, actually, we can't do this by just hiring the right people and building this incredible thing in-house. We do need partners. You need external people. One of the areas is strategy. You need someone. It's really hard to define yourself when you're looking at yourself. You need someone to look from the outside.
I always wonder. Yeah, I obviously do a lot of work in my role specifically on researching how different B2B tech businesses set their teams up, and I was surprised at first how few of them have brand strategists in house. A few of them do, but it's not universal. But I'm starting to see why now, as I'll show you come on to. Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, I think with creatives, you can definitely have creatives in house. I think strategy is one of those things where an outside perspective is really, really valuable. And I think even if you have brilliant strategists internally, it's very hard to convince yourselves that where your strategy should be, because strategy is all about projecting yourself outwards to the market. So it makes perfect sense that someone from outside is going to come in and tell you, what the deal is and how you should be projecting yourself. That makes perfect sense to me. Whereas, a creative designer is much better inside the business, because they're not just designing and using those skills. They're also, all of the business and the sales and the marketing and everything is all feeding into that design. So they've got more focus on their design, their direction, and what they're doing and why.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's sometimes a bit of pushback from especially kind of senior leadership teams who don't really understand, the role of these strategists, because there is sometimes this reticence of, don't come in and tell me, what how my brand should be positioned and my business should be positioned. You don't know us, but actually, for a start, the good ones know you well enough to be able to advise on that, but also they know how to eke that information out of the macro and micro environments outside of you as well, and how to pull that information together into something cohesive as a brand strategy.
Yeah, there's a really good was that Michael Jetta, I think he's at Stripe now. He was on one of your
Love
podcasts. Yeah,
Love
super
Hi,
interesting
Michael.
guy.
Love
Yeah, love your podcast, Michael. He said something really interesting in one of them, which was, I thought that this was my idea, this idea that popped in my head about universal and personal. And he mentioned it, and I've seen it quite a bit talked about lately, and I think it's really, really interesting. And so it's basically around the like platform brands, Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, Amazon, the platform brands, and what they all do really well is they work with this paradox of universal and personal. And there's a guy, Rishad Tabakawala, who's got this book coming out soon called Rethinking Work, and he talks about a similar thing of organizations need to take two seemingly opposite actions in order to be profitable. You need to work in this, you need to sail down this middle line between, I mean, you can apply it to all kinds of things. Things now are either really, really simple or extremely complicated. Suddenly we found ourselves with problems that we're all holding our hands up and say we can't solve this. And on the other hand, we can order food from anywhere in the world to our door in a couple of minutes. It's bizarre. But I think in terms of like business and what we're talking about with collaborating with external agencies, an external agency needs to be able to go into a business and understand what they're doing immediately, which is a paradox, because you'd say, well, the in-house team are the ones that do that. So being able to operate on those two things is kind of the future, I think. And this idea of operating in a paradox as well, I think that new technology, that's why I've said that this is probably one of the most exciting times in branding that I lived in. They suddenly give you the ability to do that. You can automate a bunch of stuff on one hand and then have a very focused conversation with an individual customer on the other, and then flip them around, So new ways of doing things. I think that universal and personal is really key. With Uber, everyone wants to get a ride, but when it's my ride, I know the name of the cab driver, and the next time I go in, the platform is telling me, is giving me all these suggestions. And the same with Amazon, that shopping online, universal. My order's very personal. I can look back and see, it knows me better than me. It knows my kids' birthdays, what I bought them at different stages of their life. So it's those two things mixing, the universal and personal, at once.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is, well, I mean, you can talk about Netflix maybe in a way, but I think the biggest one is Spotify. For those of us who use Spotify every day, and I was reading an interesting piece about one of the original engineers at Spotify talking about, how they acquired these businesses in the early days that enabled them to do things like Release Radar and Discover Weekly and your personal playlists, and obviously Wrapped and things like that. But to me, my Spotify is deeply, deeply personal. It's got all my playlists. It knows which songs I like, which songs I listen to the most. Every time that I put something on random, it's going to try and curate it according to what they think I need to listen to best. But obviously, it's massively universal because it contains pretty much all the world's music, give or take a few maverick artists that don't want to be on there. So yeah, I think that's and sorry, what's the name of that book again? It's coming up.
Rethinking Work, Rishad Tabakawala.
Yeah, definitely going to get myself a copy of that as soon as that comes out, because I think again, from an agency point of view, we're kind of rethinking how agencies work, so that could be a very timely one. Listen, I'm a bit conscious of time, Dave. I've just got one more question for you, if it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Before we wrap up, and I was really keen to just dive into how your career experiences have shaped your views on startup and fintech life, the area that you work in now. Because as we mentioned in part one, your career trajectory took you left, right, up, down. It took you to Spain. It took you to studios across the UK. Startups in Denmark, and now I don't think you'd call Carta a startup anymore, maybe, but definitely a fintech powerhouse in the US. How's that kind of shaped your views on the challenges of building? So we talked about brand evolution a lot, but obviously you have to match evolution with consistency, really. You can't be chopping and changing everything, otherwise you're consistently changing how you're viewed in people's minds. And obviously that mental availability is what you need to kind of keep one eye on at all times. So how do you approach the challenges of building a brand like that in such an ever-changing and fast-moving space like fintech, especially when you're working remotely as well and getting that great work done as a team in different areas of the world?
Yeah, I think first getting into fintechs was like a clash of everything I'd learned. It was the opposite of everything I'd learned. So I remember being on a on a call with a product marketer, and they were talking about MVPs. I didn't understand what an MVP was. They were like, "Well, we're going to do this as an MVP," and I said, "What is an MVP?" And there was a minimum viable product, and I was like, "No, that's completely the opposite of everything that I'd ever learned." My my early career was about obsession with detail, getting it perfect, getting it as right as it could possibly be. Otherwise, it doesn't go to print or it doesn't get released, whatever. I suppose that's a change that from print design, which is incredibly expensive. If you do a print run of 30,000 annual reports and there's a typo in it, that's going to cost you a lot of money. So with digital, it's not quite so difficult problem to fix. But yeah, I was just fascinated by it, and I think as well with product design and the way that product designers work. I'd never worked alongside product designers before. Really interesting design systems, and again looking at worlds colliding, design systems and brand systems, and we're talking at the moment about how those two things should be one and how that would work. So I think it's really interesting. To have that design sensibility and that importance in the detail and the finished product, but then suddenly to be thrown into somewhere where prototypes, get it done, get it out, and then test and iterate and that sort of thing. I think it's really fascinating, and it's been a really good influence on me, and I totally get it. There are certain things that have to operate the way that they do because that's the model and that's how it works. All of the facets of startups, like funding rounds and then runways and the next funding round, and every single stage you're at brings challenges to the business, and one of them is exactly what you were saying. How do you scale culture? How do you go from that incubator of brilliant ideas and the sales guy working across the table from the CEO? How do you go from that to being in different teams and being disconnected, and suddenly you don't have that flow of ideas? And similarly with brand, I think one of the challenges with startups and brands is, and it runs almost in parallel with product will build the MVP, the prototype, whatever, the get to market as quickly as possible, but then further on down the line they need to grow and they need to scale the product, but they've been built on this quick to market base. And it's exactly the same with brands, startups. If you go into a startup like pre-series A or whatever, normally the logo and the website might have been put together by one of the product designers.
Yeah, see that a lot.
Suddenly you've got to go in, and you don't want to rebrand, you don't want to change it, but you've got to somehow work with those pieces and make them into a scalable brand system, which is a real challenge. But I think brands are a challenge anyway. I think one of the things to realize is how difficult it is. I don't think people kind of appreciate that a lot of the time, because they break it down to component parts and they say, how to rebrand in 5 easy steps. If you think of what it takes to build a successful brand, is it the visual assets and the logo and the typography? Is it the messaging? Is it the tone of voice? Is it the sales calls? Is it internal culture? Is it creating, building a community and having relevant events and that kind of thing? The fact is, it's all of those things. Mm-hmm. They've all got to be on point. And not only that, but you've got to be constantly renovating and constantly switching things up and changing things. If you can have the best visual brand in the world, but if your brand experience and the user experience on the product side is bad, then you're losing that. Yeah. And on the flip side, you can have a terrible, amazing product, but terrible branding that people just don't want to interact with and that doesn't speak to them. Maybe all of those things are correct, but your tone of voice is wrong and your messaging is wrong. So there are a lot of plates to spin at once, but that's the job, that's the challenge, and that's the problem to solve.
It certainly is, and that's the problem that countless creative leaders around the world are solving. But as we said earlier, you guys are problem solvers, so this is what you love, this is what you live for.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And long may that continue, because at Shaped by, we love working with creative leaders like you guys to help solve those problems. I think it's what we live for as well. So again, I think it's possibly two sides of the same coin there, but yeah, it's a world that we love and we cherish every day. And on that note, listen, Dave, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Changemakers. Amazing conversation. Really, really happy that you came back.
Thanks, Dave.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you guys for listening to the Changemakers. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks a lot.